In the peaceful suburb of Cedar Valley, Texas, life moved at a slow and steady pace. Rows of identical houses lined the streets, families gathered for weekend barbecues, and neighbors waved at each other while mowing lawns. Among these seemingly ordinary lives lived Olivia Barnes, a young woman who, to outsiders, embodied the definition of a perfect wife and mother. At only 26, she had built a picture-perfect life with her husband, Derek, a hard-working truck driver, and their infant, son Mason. Social media painted an idyllic portrait. Olivia regularly posted cheerful photos of her baby giggling in the sunshine, videos of freshly baked cookies laid out on decorative trays, and cozy snapshots of the three of them cuddled on the couch. Her captions were always warm, filled with hearts and smiling emojis. To her followers, she was the definition of a loving mother, attentive, present, and completely devoted to her child. When Derek was away on long-haul routes, Olivia was home alone with Mason. Yet even then, she seemed to manage it all with grace. She was seen pushing Mason's stroller through the park every morning, always with a smile and a friendly hello for anyone who passed by. She'd join the other moms for play dates, often bringing homemade snacks and little toys for the children. The community adored her, trusting her completely. There was no hint of worry, no reason to suspect anything was wrong inside the Barnes household. Behind closed doors, however, things were far from perfect. Derek's job kept him on the road for days, sometimes weeks, and Olivia bore the brunt of parenting on her own. Still, no one saw her struggle. She never asked for help, never confided in anyone, never missed a beat in keeping up the perfect image. But some neighbors would later recall small things, details that didn't stand out at the time but would haunt them in hindsight. Mason rarely made noise, even for a baby his age. Sometimes Olivia would carry him stiffly, avoiding eye contact if someone commented on how quiet he was. There were days when the stroller's sunshade would be pulled completely down, hiding the child's face from view. Yet those small moments passed without second thought. After all, she was the kind, sweet Olivia everyone trusted. What no one could see was the growing darkness behind the walls of their beautiful home. The nursery, decorated in soft blues and yellows, held a strange, eerie stillness. Olivia's smile in pictures masked a reality far more sinister. The truth was hidden, in plain sight, carefully curated and filtered for the world to see. Olivia had crafted a mask so perfect that even those closest to her couldn't detect the cracks forming beneath the surface. The day everything changed began like any other. A bright morning, birds chirping, coffee brewing. Olivia posted a new photo of Mason, his eyes slightly glazed, expression blank. But no one noticed. It would be the last photo she'd ever post. Hours later, an emergency call would shatter the illusion, and the horrifying truth would begin to unfold. It was early. On a cold December morning when the quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the sound of a frantic 911 call. Olivia's voice was trembling as she explained to the dispatcher that her 1-year-old son, Mason, had suddenly stopped breathing after choking on a toy. She sounded panicked but calm enough, her words rushed, her distress palpable. Olivia claimed she had found Mason lying on the floor of the living room, unable to breathe. In a haze of fear, she had rushed him to the nearby hospital, but he was not responding. Paramedics arrived quickly, finding Olivia in a state of hysteria, her eyes wide with panic. She clutched Mason's limp body against her chest, the baby's face pale and lips blue. The emergency medical team worked fast, placing the infant on a stretcher and rushing him into the ambulance. Olivia, still holding onto his tiny hand, insisted that he had simply choked while playing, a sudden accident that no one could have foreseen. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Olivia sat in the back, her eyes fixated on her son, tears streaming down her face. She rocked him gently, murmuring to him as though begging for him to wake up, to respond to her. When they reached the emergency room, doctors and nurses immediately took over, trying to resuscitate Mason. The atmosphere in the ER was tense. Machines beeped rapidly as they tried to stabilize him, but it was too late. Despite their best efforts, Mason was declared dead shortly after arrival. Olivia collapsed in the waiting room, crying uncontrollably, her face twisted in grief. She could hardly comprehend what had just happened. Her little boy, her baby, was on. She repeatedly told hospital staff that she had no idea how it had happened, that it was all just a tragic accident. She said Mason had been playing with a toy, and then, in an instant, he began choking. She claimed she hadn't seen anything unusual leading up to the event. No one questioned her at that moment. She was a mother in mourning, and no one suspected that the truth was something far darker. But as the medical team conducted their routine procedures, they noticed something troubling, something that didn't add up. The examination of Mason's small body revealed a series of injuries. There were bruises on his arms, fresh ones that seemed too deep and too patterned to have been caused by a fall or accident. His ribs were cracked, as if they had been crushed, with significant force. His head had deep swelling, a sign of blunt trauma. The signs were unmistakable. This wasn't an innocent choking accident. This child had been harmed long before that morning. Doctors quickly notified the authorities. The police arrived at the hospital, and Olivia was immediately questioned. She maintained her story, her version of events unchanged, still consistent, with the idea of a tragic mishap, but detectives were already growing suspicious. The nature of Mason's injuries, deep bruises and broken bones, suggested a much more sinister cause than an innocent fall or choking incident. As Olivia sat in the sterile hospital room waiting to be questioned further, a knot began to tighten in the stomachs of those who had once believed her. There was more to this story than she was letting on. The investigation into Mason's death had only just begun, but Olivia's world was already beginning to crumble. The perfect mother, the woman who had never seemed anything but kind and devoted, was now at the center of a case that promised to uncover truths far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Mason's death moved quickly. Once the authorities began to piece together the evidence, Olivia's statements were scrutinized carefully, but they began to unravel with each new detail. Her story, initially simple and full of sorrow, seemed increasingly inconsistent. Detectives, determined to uncover the truth, obtained a search warrant for the Barnes home, hoping to find something that would explain the mystery behind Mason's tragic death. Inside the house, the investigators were struck by a disturbing calm. The rooms were impeccably neat, as if they had been meticulously maintained. The living room where Mason was said to have been playing looked normal at first glance, but the further the investigators dug, the more troubling the scene became. In the corner of the room, hidden behind a pile of baby blankets, they discovered a small battered high chair. The straps on the arms were tightly bound, as though they had been used to restrain someone. The cushions were worn down, as if the chair had seen far more use than it should have for a child of Mason's age. It was clear that this wasn't just a place to sit. It had been a tool, one that had been used for something much darker, They combed through the rest of the house. More unsettling findings emerged. A laundry basket, tucked away in Olivia's bedroom, contained baby clothes that were stained with blood. The garments were small, nothing more than infant-sized onesies, but they told a terrifying story. They had been hidden away, as though Olivia thought she could get away with covering up the signs of abuse. There was no way the bloodstains had come from a simple accident. The evidence was beginning to mount, and it was becoming clear that something far more sinister had been happening in the Barnes home. What disturbed the detectives even more was what they found on Olivia's computer. In a hidden folder there were disturbing journal entries, dark and obsessive writings that detailed Olivia's relationship with her son. She spoke of Mason as if he were a burden, an obstacle in her life that she was growing increasingly resentful of. One entry described Mason's crying as constant noise, something that drove her to frustration and anger. She referred to him as the thing I never wanted, and detailed the pain she felt when she couldn't escape the demands of motherhood. She wrote about the pressure of having to be a perfect mother, the weight of the social expectations that she felt she couldn't bear. It became clear that Olivia had not only resented Mason, but had come to view him as something to be controlled, something to be dealt with. Among the photos on the computer, there were images that sent chills down the spine of the investigators. Some of them were of Mason, strapped into the high chair, his tiny body bruised and marked. Others showed Mason's face swollen from what appeared to be repeated beatings. The evidence was undeniable. The abuse had been ongoing for months, and no one had suspected a thing. The investigation took a dark turn as the police began to understand the true extent of the abuse. Olivia had been tormenting her son for months, slowly breaking him down, both physically and emotionally. The pattern of the abuse was methodical, calculated. She had made efforts to hide the evidence, to cover up what she had done, but now it was all coming to light. Every corner of the Barnes home told a story of cruelty and manipulation, of a mother who had lost her way and become capable of unthinkable acts. As the investigators prepared to arrest Olivia, they knew the case was far from over. There were still so many questions left unanswered, so much left to uncover about the woman who had once seemed so perfect, yet had become something far darker. As the investigation deepened, the police began to unravel the horrifying history behind Olivia's life, a history that no one had known about. Her past was not one of simple misfortune, but of deep, unresolved trauma. Olivia's childhood had been far from the picture-perfect life she portrayed in front of others. Born to a single mother who struggled with addiction and a string of abusive boyfriends, Olivia's early years were filled with instability and neglect. Her father had abandoned the family when she was just a toddler, leaving her mother to raise her on her own. The absence of a father figure and the constant instability at home shaped Olivia's perception of relationships and family. She grew up in an environment where emotional neglect and physical abuse were commonplace. But it wasn't until later, in her teenage years, that the true impact of her upbringing began to show. At 14, Olivia was removed from her mother's care after a series of violent incidents between her mother and her boyfriends escalated. Child Protective Services placed her in a foster home, where she spent a year living in a structured environment, away from the chaos she had known. It was during this time that Olivia was diagnosed with a personality disorder, one that involved deep emotional instability, impulsivity, and a tendency to view others as either entirely good or entirely bad. Despite being in therapy, Olivia's deep-seated issues with abandonment and trust never fully healed. She struggled with forming healthy attachments, often pushing people away while simultaneously craving love and approval. By the time she turned 18, Olivia was back in the custody of her mother, despite the emotional and physical scars that still lingered from their turbulent years together. At this point, Olivia's behavior had become increasingly erratic. She entered into relationships with men who were emotionally distant or abusive, a pattern that mirrored the toxic relationships she had witnessed as a child. It wasn't long. before Olivia met Derek Barnes, a truck driver who seemed like a breath of fresh air compared to the men she had been involved with in the past. He was kind and seemingly stable, but even he had no idea of the emotional storm brewing inside her. Their marriage, which seemed perfect from the outside, was in fact a continuation of Olivia's unresolved trauma. Derek spent long hours on the road, and Olivia was left alone to care for Mason. The isolation, coupled with the immense pressure of motherhood, caused cracks in Olivia's mental state that slowly began to widen. Without anyone to confide in, she turned inward, her emotional struggles becoming more pronounced. The idea of motherhood, which had once seemed like a dream, quickly became a nightmare. Olivia couldn't cope with the constant demands of caring for a baby, and rather than seeking help or reaching out for support, she internalized her frustration. The growing resentment she felt for Mason took root. In her journal entries, she spoke of her anger at him for taking away her freedom, for making her feel trapped in a life she never wanted. She wrote about how he would cry for hours, disrupting the perfect image she tried to maintain for the outside world. She wrote about how, when he was quiet, it was easier to pretend everything was fine. But when he cried, when he needed her, it felt like a burden too heavy to bear. The pressure of keeping up appearances, of maintaining the facade of a perfect family, eventually pushed Olivia to the brink. The emotional instability she had been carrying since childhood manifested in violent, uncontrollable ways. She began to take out her anger on Mason, a helpless baby who could do nothing to protect himself. Her actions grew more calculated, her cruelty more deliberate. She used the high chair, the straps, to keep Mason restrained for long periods of time, sometimes leaving him in that position for hours. She burned him with objects in the kitchen, trying to treat the injuries with ointments, hiding the evidence as if she believed she could erase what she was doing. It became a twisted cycle of control, frustration, and resentment. As the detectives uncovered this disturbing past, they began to understand that Olivia's actions were not just those of a frustrated mother. They were the actions of a woman, deeply broken by her past, a woman whose unresolved trauma had festered until it consumed her. The abuse had been methodical, cold, and calculated, revealing the depths of Olivia's emotional instability. What had once been a seemingly perfect life had over time become a nightmare that no one had seen coming, and that would leave an indelible scar on the community. Olivia Barnes was arrested shortly after the full extent of the investigation came to light. As she was taken into custody, her face remained blank, almost expressionless, as though she had detached herself from the gravity of the situation. The shock that had once consumed her when Mason was declared dead was now replaced by a chilling calm, as though she had become numb to the horror of her actions. She was charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse, a crime so incomprehensible that even the officers who had worked the case found themselves struggling to make sense of it. The courtroom trial was a spectacle of emotions, with the public reeling from the shock of it all. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, medical reports, and the chilling journal entries Olivia had kept all told a grim story. The prosecution painted a picture of a mother who had systematically tortured her son, holding him captive in his own home. His cries ignored, his pain unacknowledged. The images of Mason strapped into the high chair, his body covered in bruises and burns, were impossible to ignore. The photographs were shown to the jury, each image more disturbing than the last, each one a silent witness to the unimaginable cruelty he had suffered in the hands of the woman who was supposed to protect him. Throughout the trial, Olivia showed no signs of remorse. Her defense team tried to argue that her actions had been the result of her untreated mental illness, claiming that she had been a victim of her past and that her emotional instability had driven her to lash out in ways she couldn't control. They painted her as a broken woman, struggling with unresolved trauma, unable to cope with the demands of motherhood. But the prosecution was resolute. They argued that while Olivia's past may have shaped her, it did not excuse her actions. She had made deliberate choices to harm her son, to suppress his cries, to bind him, to hurt him over time. This wasn't an outburst of uncontrollable rage. It was cold, calculated abuse. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. Olivia was found guilty on all charges. The jury deliberated for only a few hours, knowing that the evidence left little room for doubt. The sentence was swift and final: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Olivia's face remained unchanged as the judge handed down the sentence. It was as though she had become a spectator in her own life, detached from the consequences of her actions. She showed no emotion, no relief, no guilt. She simply stood there, as though the life she had built, the life that had once appeared so perfect, had ceased to matter. For Derek, the trial was an unthinkable nightmare. He had loved Olivia, trusted her with their son, and believed in the life they had built together. When the truth came to light, he was shattered. He had spent years working long hours to provide for his family, and he had been blind to the signs of abuse in his own home. Derek's heartache was profound, and the guilt he felt was overwhelming. He had never suspected that Olivia, the woman he had married, could harbor such darkness. The man who had once been so confident in his family's happiness was now left, grappling with the aftermath of a tragedy that had torn his life apart. Mason was laid to rest in a small, quiet cemetery, a tiny body lost to the world in a way that felt unbearably unjust. The community, still reeling from the discovery of the abuse, held a vigil for the child whose life had been stolen so senselessly. In the years that followed, a memorial fund was established in Mason's name, aimed at raising awareness about child abuse and providing support for mothers struggling with mental health issues. The tragedy of Mason's life, and his death, served as a painful reminder of the hidden dangers that can lie beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect families. As for Olivia, she was taken to a maximum security prison where she would live out the rest of her days. Her life had been one of brokenness, trauma, and emotional chaos. The woman who had once smiled for the camera, who had appeared to have it all, was now just another inmate lost in the system. The unanswered question, what drove Olivia to such extremes, would never be fully understood. Was it her past, her mental illness, or something deeper that caused her to inflict such suffering on her own child? The answers remained buried in the depths of her soul, hidden behind the walls of a mind.